I bought my own house at a foreclosure auction. And I made sure my son, David, was there to watch me do it. He stood at the back of the crowd, his face pale, as I calmly raised my paddle and placed the winning bid. I know what you're probably thinking. That it sounds cruel, like the act of a cold-hearted man. But to understand why I let him watch his world crumble, you have to understand how he first shattered mine. You have to know about the home I built with my own two hands, the one where every floorboard held a memory of my late wife, Eleanor, and every wall echoed with our son's childhood laughter. That house was my life's work, a sanctuary I willingly signed over to him, believing it would keep our family together. I was wrong. This isn't just a story about a house. It's about how a father's love was repaid with the coldest betrayal imaginable. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions on this story in the comments. Believe me, you'll want to hear how it all unfolded. For 40 years, my mornings began the same way. The sun would creep over the eastern ridge, casting long golden fingers of light through the large bay window I'd installed myself in the summer of '83. That light would slowly make its way across the polished oak floors, the same floors where a 3-year-old David once skidded in his socks, his laughter echoing off the high ceilings. I'd sit at the kitchen table, the one I built from a single slab of maple, and drink my coffee, black. The air always held a faint, lingering scent of Eleanor's rose garden just outside, mixed with the smell of old wood and a lifetime of memories. The house wasn't just a structure. It was a living, breathing album of our lives. Every scuff mark on the floor, every faint stain on the kitchen counter was a story. After Eleanor passed, the silence became a physical presence. The house felt too big, too quiet. Her humming was gone from the kitchen, her scent was fading from the pillows, and the vibrant colors of our life together seemed to wash out into muted shades of gray. David was all I had left, and when he and his new wife Jessica were looking for a place to start their own family, my decision felt simple. It felt right. I wasn't just giving them a house. I was entrusting them with our family's heart. I imagined the sound of grandchildren's feet pattering down the hallway, filling the silence that had become so deafening. So on a clear afternoon in May, I signed the deed over to them. No lawyers, no complicated clauses, just a father's gift to his son. I moved my things into the small guest room downstairs, content with the idea of being a quiet, steady presence in the background of their new life. My world after she was gone had shrunk to the confines of a single worn leather armchair. Eleanor and I had bought it on our 10th anniversary, a big splurge for us back in 1987. We'd spent a whole Saturday driving from one furniture store to another until she saw it. "That's the one, Clark," she'd said, running her hand over the rich brown leather. "That's a chair you can grow old in," and I did. The leather was cracked and faded now, molded perfectly to the shape of my body after thousands of evenings spent reading by the fire. From that chair, I had a perfect view of the living room, and I watched as my home began to transform into their house. The warm, buttery yellow paint we'd chosen for the walls was the first thing to go, replaced by a sterile, lifeless gray that Jessica called sophisticated. The warm brass light fixtures we'd picked out were torn down and replaced with cold, blue-white LED lights that made the room feel like a doctor's office. I'd sit in my armchair, silent, as they discussed their plans. Their voices were always bright and excited, full of talk about open concepts and increasing the resale value. They never asked what I thought. To them, the handcrafted bookshelves I'd spent a month building were just cluttered, and the sturdy oak banister I'd carved by hand was dated. I tried not to let it bother me. A house needs to evolve, I told myself. It needs new life. But it was the little things that chipped away at me. One afternoon, I watched Jessica take down the framed photo of Eleanor and me on our wedding day that had hung over the fireplace for 35 years. She replaced it with a large, abstract painting of blue and silver lines. "It just opens up the space so much more," she explained to a friend on the phone later, not realizing I could hear her from my room. I found our wedding photo tucked away in a dusty box in the garage, its glass cracked. I didn't say a word. I just took the photo back to my little room and set it on my nightstand. David was different when Jessica was around. When it was just the two of us, sometimes I'd see a flicker of the boy I raised. He'd ask about my day or talk about a game, and for a moment it felt like old times. But as soon as she entered the room, a wall would go up. He'd become more formal, more distant. They tolerated me, like a piece of old furniture they didn't know what to do with. I was the living relic of a past they were systematically erasing, one coat of gray paint at a time. I'd sit there in my leather armchair, the last untouched piece of my history, and feel a draft I couldn't place, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the slow, quiet erosion of a life I thought was built to last forever. The first few months were a study in quiet adjustments. I learned the new sounds of the house, the sharp, clinical click of the new cabinet doors instead of the familiar soft groan of the old oak ones, the whisper-quiet hum of the new dishwasher that replaced the rumbling old machine Eleanor and I used to joke could drown out a thunderstorm. I learned to navigate my life within the shrinking territory of my guest room and my leather armchair. From that chair, I became a silent spectator to the dismantling of my own history. It started with small things, little paper cuts to the soul. One evening, I was reheating some soup on the stove, using the heavy-bottomed pot Eleanor had loved. Jessica walked in, her nose wrinkled slightly. "Clark, could you please use the microwave for things like that?" she said, her voice dripping with a kind of strained politeness. "The smell of leftovers tends to linger." She gestured vaguely at the new stainless steel kitchen. I looked down at the pot, the same one that had held countless stews and sauces that had fed our family for decades. The smell wasn't the issue. My presence was. I just nodded, poured my soup into a bowl, and retreated to my room. David was standing by the fridge, his back to me. He didn't turn around. He didn't say a word. The paper cuts grew deeper. A few weeks later, on a crisp Saturday morning, I was in the backyard, tending to Eleanor's rose garden. It was my last remaining connection to her, a riot of color and fragrance we had cultivated together. The soil was cool and damp in my hands, and the sweet, heavy scent of the peace roses filled the air. I remembered her laughing as a thorn snagged her sweater, her cheeks flushed from the sun. Then I heard their voices coming from the patio. Jessica was holding a sleek tablet, showing David a digital rendering. "See? A full slate patio, with a built-in fire pit and seating area. It's clean, modern, and perfect for entertaining," she said, her voice sharp with excitement. "We can get rid of all these thorny bushes. They're so high maintenance." My hands froze in the dirt. Thorny bushes. That's what Eleanor's life's passion had been reduced to. I looked at David, praying he would remember the afternoons he'd spent out here with his mother, learning the names of each rose. He glanced over at me, his eyes holding a flicker of something, guilt, maybe. Before it was extinguished, he looked back at the tablet. "It would definitely increase the property value, Jess," he said, his voice trying too hard to sound practical. "It's a smart move." He didn't look at me again. I stayed there, kneeling in the dirt long after they went back inside, the scent of the roses suddenly feeling like a funeral wreath. The final crack appeared on a rainy Tuesday night. I was in my armchair, reading a book, the soft light of my lamp, a small, warm island in the sea of their cold, gray living room. They thought I had already gone to bed. They were sitting at the new granite island in the kitchen, their voices low but carrying in the house's new, empty acoustics. They were talking about money. "The home equity line of credit was approved," Jessica said, and I could hear the sound of a pen tapping on paper. "With the money from this, we can finish the master bathroom and maybe even put a down payment on that rental property downtown." David sounded hesitant. "Are you sure about this, Jess?" "We're leveraging the whole house. If my business has a bad quarter." Her response was quiet, but every word was a shard of glass in the silence. "David, relax. It's an asset. The best part is, it was basically free money. It's not like we had to work 30 years to pay for it." Free money. I closed my eyes. The book in my lap felt impossibly heavy. My life's work, the monument I had built to my family, the gift I had given out of love, was just free money to them. An asset to be stripped and leveraged until nothing was left. I didn't move. I sat there in the dark, the leather of the armchair cool against my skin, and I felt the last bit of warmth in the house finally die. It was no longer a home. It was a balance sheet. And I was no longer a father. I was just a line item they had already written off. The breaking point didn't come like a thunderclap. It arrived on a frigid Tuesday in October, quiet and sharp as a shard of ice. I was in the garage, the one place that still felt like mine. The air was thick, with the familiar, comforting smell of pine sawdust and old motor oil. My hand, wrinkled and calloused, rested on the heavy oak workbench I'd built with my father when I was just a boy. I could still see the faint, pencil-drawn lines where I'd taught a 7-year-old David how to measure a piece of wood for his first birdhouse. I ran my thumb over a deep gouge near the edge, a mistake he'd made with a chisel, and I remembered how his face had crumpled, thinking he'd ruined it. I just laughed and told him, "Son, it's not a mistake, it's character." That bench had more character than anything in the main house now. It held the story of my life, written in sawdust and sweat. The side door creaked open, letting in a slice of cold, gray light. David and Jessica stepped inside, their shoes making soft, intrusive sounds on the concrete floor. They didn't look at me, not at first. Their eyes were scanning the space, measuring it, assessing it. They saw walls and square footage, not a lifetime of projects and dreams. I felt a familiar knot tighten in my stomach, the one that appeared whenever they looked at my world with their cold, practical eyes. I straightened up, wiping my hands on my worn flannel shirt, waiting. David cleared his throat. He couldn't quite meet my gaze, his eyes fixed on a set of old wrenches hanging on the pegboard. "Dad," he began, and the words sounded hollow, stripped of its warmth. "We've been thinking." Jessica stepped forward, her arms crossed. She always took the lead when something unpleasant needed to be said. "What David is trying to say, Clark, is that we need to be practical about the space. We've been looking at options, and this garage could be converted into a fantastic home gym. It would add at least $15,000 to the home's value." I stared at her, then at my son, who was now studying a crack in the floor as if it held the secrets of the universe. A home gym. They wanted to replace the scent of sawdust with the smell of rubber and sweat. They wanted to tear out the bench where I had passed down my skills to my son. "And your room," Jessica continued, her voice as crisp and sterile as a new bill, "is the perfect size for a home office for me. The lighting is excellent, and it's away from the main living area." The air in my lungs felt like it was turning to stone. I couldn't speak. I just watched her, this stranger who wore my son's love like a trophy. She finally looked at me, her expression a careful mix of sympathy and impatience. "We found a wonderful place for you," she said, as if offering me a prize. "It's called Oak Meadows Senior Living. It's only 20 minutes from here. We've already put down the deposit for the first month. It's $2,800, but it includes 3 meals a day, laundry service, and social activities. You'll be much more comfortable there, around people your own age." The words hung in the cold air, a deposit, all arranged. They hadn't asked me. They had decided for me. They had bought and sold my future without my consent. I looked at David, my heart pleading with him. "Say something. Tell her she's wrong. Tell her this is my home." He finally lifted his head, and the flicker of guilt I saw in his eyes was quickly extinguished by a hard, determined resolve. He was a stranger. My voice, when it finally came, was a whisper, a dry rustle of leaves. "This is my home." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of a truth I was desperately clinging to. I built this place. My wife died in this place. My memories lived in every stud and joist. David shook his head slowly, a sad, final gesture. The look on his face wasn't one of anger, but of pity. The pity you give to something you have to put down. "It's our house now, Dad," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The papers were signed a long time ago." He used my own gift as a weapon against me. He took the ultimate act of a father's love and twisted it into a legal loophole to throw me out. Jessica gave a small, satisfied nod, as if a difficult business transaction had just been concluded. They turned and walked out, leaving the door ajar. I stood there for a long time, my hand still resting on the workbench. The wood felt cold. I looked down at my hands, the ones that had built this home, that had held my son when he was born, that had held my wife as she took her last breath. They felt useless. But as the minutes ticked by in the suffocating silence, a different feeling began to surface, rising from the cold ashes of my heartbreak. It wasn't rage. It was something colder, clearer, and much, much stronger. It was the quiet, unshakable certainty of a man who had just realized that character wasn't built into a workbench. It was built inside you, and they had just found out how much of it I had left. I didn't run after them. I didn't shout. The sound of the kitchen door closing was a flat, final punctuation mark on a sentence I hadn't been allowed to finish. I just stood there, my hand still resting on the workbench, the scarred oak feeling like the only solid thing left in the world. The cold from the concrete floor seeped through the soles of my boots, a slow, creeping numbness that matched the one spreading through my chest. But as the minutes passed in the dusty silence, the initial shock began to recede, and something else took its place. It wasn't the hot, blinding rage I might have expected. It was a cold, quiet clarity. A stillness so profound it felt like the eye of a hurricane. I could see the entire scene playing out in my head if I'd followed them inside. The pleading, the shouting, the useless appeal to a history they had already decided to demolish. I would have listed every sacrifice, every late night I worked to pay for that roof, every memory embedded in the walls. And they would have met it with that same look of patient pity. The look you give a confused old man who doesn't understand that the world has moved on without him. To them, my love was a liability, and my memories were clutter. Arguing with them would be like trying to reason with the tide. They had already calculated my value, and it was less than the cost of a new home gym. So I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of watching me break. They saw me as weak, sentimental, a relic of a bygone era who could be neatly filed away in a place called Oak Meadows. And in that moment, I decided to become exactly what they thought I was. I would let them see a defeated old man. I would pack a single suitcase with a few worn shirts and the cracked photograph of my Eleanor. I would let them drive me to that beige-walled facility, and I would even thank them for their concern. I would play the part they had written for me, because their arrogance was now my greatest asset. I ran my thumb over the deep gouge on the workbench one last time. The mistake my son had made as a boy. It wasn't character, it was a scar, and I had a few of my own now. They thought this was an ending. They thought they were closing a chapter, neatly tying up a loose end. They had absolutely no idea that I was just getting started. Standing there in the gloom, surrounded by the ghosts of what I had built, I made a silent vow. This was not over. They will not see this coming. I turned, walked to the door, and pulled it shut without looking back. The solid click of the latch was the only sound. It was the sound of a plan being born. The phone call ended, but I didn't hang up right away. I held the cold plastic to my ear for a few more seconds, listening to the dead air, the empty space where my son's desperate sobs had been. There was no victory in that sound, no satisfaction, just a quiet, hollow echo. I placed the phone back in its cradle with a soft click. My apartment was small, meticulously clean, but it had the impersonal feel of a hotel room you've stayed in for too long. There were no photographs on the walls, no scuff marks on the floor, no memories baked into the plaster. It was a place to exist, not to live. For 5 years, this was my world. A world of beige walls and functional furniture, a stark contrast to the home I had built, the home filled with the warm scent of Eleanor's life. The next morning, Monday, September 15th, I woke before dawn. The check from the tech company was on my nightstand, a single piece of heavy, glossy paper that felt heavier than the entire deed to my old house. It was for exactly $2,112,500. I dressed in my best clothes, a simple pair of pressed slacks and a clean collared shirt, and walked to the downtown branch of the First National Bank. The teller was a young woman with kind eyes who probably thought I was depositing my life's savings. In a way, I was. I slid the check under the glass. She looked at it, her eyes widening slightly, then looked back at me. I just nodded. She processed the transaction with professional efficiency. A few minutes later, she handed me a receipt. My new balance was a number so large it looked like a mistake. But it wasn't a mistake, it was a tool. It was the key. My next stop was a law firm on the 3rd floor of an old brick building on Market Street. The sign on the door read, Evans & Associates Real Estate Law. The air inside smelled of old books, leather, and quiet competence. Mr. Evans was a man in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and a gaze that missed nothing. I didn't tell him the whole story. I didn't need to. I told him the facts. A property I was interested in was up for a foreclosure auction. I needed to understand the process, and I needed representation to ensure the transfer of title was clean and swift if I were to win. I was a man with capital looking to make a sound investment. That was the language he understood. He laid it all out for me with methodical precision. The auction was scheduled for Friday, October 3rd, at 10 a.m. on the county courthouse steps. The property was listed under case number 734FC2023. The bank's opening bid was projected to be $427,381.14, the exact amount remaining on the loans David and Jessica had taken out. To be a registered bidder, Mr. Evans explained, his pen tapping a neat line on a legal pad, you will need a cashier's check for 10% of the opening bid made out to the county clerk. That comes to $42,738.11. We'll round it up to $43,000 just to be safe. It's a deposit. If you don't win, you get it back immediately. If you do, it goes toward the purchase price. The balance is due within 30 days. I listened, absorbing every detail. I wasn't just a sentimental old man anymore. I was a client, a buyer, a force to be reckoned with. I paid his retainer of $5,000 without hesitation. For the next 2 weeks, I prepared. I spent my evenings in the public library, not reading novels, but studying county records and recent auction results. I learned the rhythm of the auctioneers, the subtle signals of serious bidders versus curious onlookers. I learned that most foreclosure auctions are quiet, somber affairs attended by a few professional investors. A family drama playing out on the courthouse steps was rare. I went online to the auction listing. I saw pictures of my house, my home. The gray walls looked flat and lifeless in the photos. The slate patio where Eleanor's roses once bloomed looked cold and uninviting. The listing described it as a, quote, 4-bedroom, 3-bath property in need of some cosmetic updates. Great potential for the right investor. My life's work, reduced to a sales pitch. I found myself thinking about the old workbench in the garage. I wondered if it was still there. I remembered teaching David how to use a handsaw on that bench, his small hands struggling to hold the tool steady. I'd guided his grip, showing him how to let the saw do the work. Patience, son. I'd told him. Measure twice, cut once. Don't ever force it. He had forgotten that lesson. He had forced everything, his marriage, his business, his life, leveraging the foundation I had given him until it crumbled. He saw the house as free money, a shortcut. He never understood that its true value was in the time, the patience, and the love that went into building it. On Thursday, October 2nd, the day before the auction, I went back to the bank. I stood before a different teller this time and requested a cashier's check for $43,000. She slid the crisp, official-looking check under the glass. It felt different from the deposit slip. This wasn't potential anymore. This was action. I tucked it into the inside pocket of my jacket, the paper resting against my chest like a shield. I walked out of the bank and into the cool autumn air. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a profound, unshakable calm. I was a builder. And I was about to lay a new foundation. This one, they would never be able to take from me. The phone call ended, but I didn't hang up right away. I held the cold plastic to my ear for a few more seconds, listening to the dead air, the empty space where my son's desperate sobs had been. There was no victory in that sound, no satisfaction, just a quiet, hollow echo. I placed the phone back in its cradle with a soft click. My apartment was small, meticulously clean, but it had the impersonal feel of a hotel room you've stayed in for too long. There were no photographs on the walls, no scuff marks on the floor, no memories baked into the plaster. It was a place to exist, not to live. For 5 years, this was my world. A world of beige walls and functional furniture. A stark contrast to the home I had built. The home filled with the warm scent of Eleanor's life. I looked at my hands, the knuckles swollen slightly with age, but still strong. They had built a home, and now they would unmake a ruin. The next morning, Monday, September 15th, I woke before dawn. The check from the tech company was on my nightstand, a single piece of heavy, glossy paper that felt heavier than the entire deed to my old house. It was for exactly $2 million, $112,500. I dressed in my best clothes, a simple pair of pressed slacks and a clean collared shirt, and walked to the downtown branch of the First National Bank. The teller was a young woman with kind eyes who probably thought I was depositing my life's savings. In a way, I was. I slid the check under the glass. She looked at it, her eyes widening slightly, then looked back at me. I just nodded. She processed the transaction with professional efficiency, the quiet tap of her keyboard and the solid thud of her stamp, the only sounds in the hushed morning air. A few minutes later, she handed me a receipt. My new balance was a number so large it looked like a mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. It was a tool. It was the key. My next stop was a law firm on the third floor of an old brick building on Market Street. The sign on the door read, Evans & Associates, Real Estate Law. The air inside smelled of old books, leather, and quiet competence. Mr. Evans was a man in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and a gaze that missed nothing. I didn't tell him the whole story. I didn't need to. I told him the facts. A property I was interested in was up for a foreclosure auction. I needed to understand the process, and I needed representation to ensure the transfer of title was clean and swift if I were to win. I was a man with capital looking to make a sound investment. That was the language he understood. He didn't see a grieving husband or a betrayed father. He saw a serious client, and that was exactly what I needed. He laid it all out for me with methodical precision. The auction was scheduled for Friday, October 3rd at 10 a.m. on the county courthouse steps. The property was listed under case number 734 FC2023. The bank's opening bid was projected to be $427,381.14, the exact amount remaining on the loans David and Jessica had taken out. To be a registered bidder, Mr. Evans explained, his pen tapping a neat line on a legal pad, you will need a cashier's check for 10% of the opening bid, made out to the county clerk. That comes to $42,738.11. We'll round it up to $43,000 just to be safe. It's a deposit. If you don't win, you get it back immediately. If you do, it goes toward the purchase price. The balance is due within 30 days. I listened, absorbing every detail. I wasn't just a sentimental old man anymore. I was a client, a buyer, a force to be reckoned with. I paid his retainer of $5,000 without hesitation. For the next 2 weeks, I prepared. I spent my evenings in the public library, not reading novels but studying county records and recent auction results. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I scrolled through microfilm and navigated clunky government websites. I learned the rhythm of the auctioneers, the subtle signals of serious bidders versus curious onlookers. I learned that most foreclosure auctions are quiet, somber affairs attended by a few professional investors. A family drama playing out on the courthouse steps was rare. I went online to the auction listing. I saw pictures of my house, my home. The gray walls looked flat and lifeless in the photos. The slate patio, where Eleanor's roses once bloomed, looked cold and uninviting, stained with mildew in the corners. The listing described it as a 4-bedroom, 3-bath property in need of some cosmetic updates. Great potential for the right investor. My life's work, reduced to a sales pitch. I found myself thinking about the old workbench in the garage. I wondered if it was still there. Had they torn it out to make room for a treadmill and a weight rack? I remembered teaching David how to use a handsaw on that bench, his small hands struggling to hold the tool steady. I'd guided his grip, showing him how to let the saw do the work. Patience, son. I'd told him, my voice gentle. Measure twice, cut once. Don't ever force it. He had forgotten that lesson. He had forced everything. His marriage, his business, his life, leveraging the foundation I had given him until it crumbled under the weight of his impatience and greed. He saw the house as free money, a shortcut to a life he felt he deserved without the work. He never understood that its true value was in the time, the patience, and the love that went into building it, board by board, memory by memory. On Thursday, October 2nd, the day before the auction, I went back to the bank. I stood before a different teller this time and requested a cashier's check for $43,000. She slid the crisp, official-looking check under the glass. It felt different from the deposit slip. This wasn't potential anymore, this was action. I tucked it into the inside pocket of my jacket, the paper resting against my chest like a shield. I walked out of the bank and into the cool autumn air. The leaves were turning, painting the city in shades of gold and rust, the same colors that used to fill the trees outside my living room window. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a profound, unshakable calm. I was a builder, and I was about to lay a new foundation. This one, they would never be able to take from me. I had measured twice. Now it was time to make the cut. The phone rang again 2 days later. It was Tuesday, just 3 days before the auction. I was sitting by my window watching the rain streak down the glass, turning the city lights into a blurry watercolor painting. This time, David's voice wasn't choked with tears. It was tight, strained, laced with an urgency that bordered on a demand. "We need to talk, Dad, in person, before Friday." He didn't ask, he told. I felt the subtle shift in his strategy, from pitiful son to cornered man. I agreed without hesitation. "The diner on Elm Street, tomorrow at 9. I chose the place. A small, anonymous spot with cracked vinyl booths and the smell of stale coffee and bacon grease in the air. A place with no history for us. A place where we would be nothing more than strangers sharing a table. They were already there when I arrived, huddled in a booth by the back wall. David looked like he hadn't slept in days, his eyes shadowed and his shoulders slumped. Jessica sat ramrod straight beside him, a porcelain doll of barely contained fury. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the hard set of her jaw. A single, untouched cup of coffee sat in front of each of them, growing cold. I slid into the booth opposite them, the vinyl sighing under my weight. I didn't order anything. I just folded my hands on the Formica tabletop and waited. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the clatter of plates from the kitchen and the low murmur of other conversations. David broke it first, leaning forward, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. "Dad, we know you're angry. We get it. We messed up. Terribly. But this is our home we're talking about. The home you and Mom built. Think about what she would want." He tried to fill his voice with sincere remorse, but it came out thin, rehearsed. He was invoking her memory, using Eleanor as a shield, a tool for manipulation. It was the lowest kind of emotional blackmail, and it was all he had left. I met his desperate gaze with a calm that felt like a sheet of ice. My voice was low even, betraying none of the storm that had raged inside me for 5 years. "You're right, David. It was the home your mother and I built. And you and Jessica made it very clear on a cold Tuesday in October that it was no longer mine. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The simple, unadorned truth was a heavier blow than any accusation." Jessica's control finally snapped. She leaned forward, her eyes flashing with a venomous fire. "Oh, stop with the martyr act, Clark. We were trying to build a future, to be successful. We couldn't do that with you sitting in that dusty old armchair, judging our every move, holding us back with all your sentimental junk." Her words were a physical assault, aimed at the one piece of my old life I held sacred. The chair. The symbol of my life with Eleanor. To her, it was just dusty furniture, an obstacle. "We don't need a lecture," she continued, her voice rising slightly. "We need help. The bank needs $427, $381.14 by the end of the month. Or we lose everything. Your patent money. That article said you got over $2 million. You could clear our debt and we'd still have enough for a fresh start. You owe us that. We're your family." There it was, the raw, naked entitlement. They hadn't taken me in. They had tolerated my presence in exchange for a multi-million-dollar asset. My gift of love had been, in their minds, a down payment on their future. I looked from her furious face to my son's pleading one. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was letting her fight his battle, just as he had let her make his decisions. "The word you're looking for is not, oh," I said, my voice still quiet. "I gave you a home, free and clear, a foundation. What you built on top of it and the debt you incurred, that belongs to you." "So that's it?" David finally spoke, his voice cracking with disbelief. "You're just going to let the bank take our home? Your grandchildren's home?" Grandchildren? The word was out of my mouth before I could stop it. It was a cold, bitter question. In the 5 years I was gone, there had been no calls, no letters, no mention of any grandchildren. Jessica scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "We were planning on it, once we were financially stable." The lie was so transparent, so pathetic it almost made me laugh. They were using children who didn't exist as another bargaining chip. I looked at my son, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose first home run I had cheered. I saw nothing of him left. Only this weak, desperate man who had sold his soul for a slate patio and the illusion of success. I pushed myself out of the booth. The conversation was over. There was nothing left to say. "Dad, wait!" David scrambled to his feet, his voice a raw plea. "Don't do this, please." I paused at the end of the table and looked at him, really looked at him, for the last time. "You taught me a valuable lesson, David. You taught me that a signature on a piece of paper is more powerful than a lifetime of love. I'm just a man who learns his lessons well." I placed a $5 bill on the table to cover their cold coffee. "I'll see you on Friday." I turned and walked out of the diner, not looking back. The bell above the door chimed softly behind me, a final, tinny sound marking the end of it all. The rain had stopped, and the air was clean and cold. I took a deep breath. There was no sadness left. Only resolve. The auction was no longer about revenge. It was about reclamation. It was about buying back the part of my soul they had tried to foreclose on. The morning of Friday, October 3rd, broke cold and clear. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the autumn sun did little to warm the granite steps of the county courthouse. A small crowd of about 20 people had gathered, mostly men in nondescript jackets, professional investors with practiced, indifferent faces. They milled about, sipping coffee from paper cups, their conversations low and technical. I stood slightly apart from them, my hands in my pockets, my bidder's paddle, a simple wooden stick with the number 27 printed on it, tucked inside my jacket. My lawyer, Mr. Evans, stood beside me, a silent, reassuring presence. I felt a strange sense of peace, the kind that comes after a long storm has passed. The wind whipped around the corner of the building, carrying the scent of dry leaves and exhaust fumes. I was just another face in the crowd, another investor looking for a deal. Then I saw them. David and Jessica were climbing the steps, looking harried and out of place. David's suit was rumpled, and his face was pale and drawn, his eyes darting around nervously. Jessica was a statue of brittle tension, her designer coat pulled tight around her, as if to ward off more than just the morning chill. Her eyes found me, and for a moment they widened with a flicker of desperate hope. She thought I was here to save them. She thought my presence was the answer to their prayers. David followed her gaze, and a wave of visible relief washed over his face. He started toward me, a pathetic, hopeful smile forming on his lips. He thought his father had come to the rescue. They still didn't understand. The auctioneer, a portly man with a booming voice, stepped up to the podium. "All right, folks, let's get started. First property up for auction today is located at 1428 Willow Creek Lane." He rattled off the legal description, a sterile list of lot numbers and boundaries that erased any sense of a home. "This is case number 734FC2023. We will open the bidding at the bank's price of $427,381.14. He looked out over the small crowd. "Do I have an opening bid?" A man in a navy blue windbreaker raised his paddle. "428, he said, his voice flat. "I have 428, the auctioneer boomed. "Do I hear 430? Another man nodded. 430. The bidding continued in small, predictable increments. 435, 436. David was standing frozen a few feet away from me, his hopeful smile dissolving into a mask of confusion. He kept looking at me, his eyes pleading. Why wasn't I bidding? Why was I letting these strangers pick over the bones of his life? He took a step closer, his voice a frantic whisper. "Dad, what are you doing? Bid! You have to bid!" I didn't even turn my head to look at him. I kept my eyes on the auctioneer. The bidding had stalled at $440,000. The man in the windbreaker was shaking his head. It wasn't a good enough deal for him. $440,000, the auctioneer called out. Going once. David grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Dad, please! This is everything!" Going twice. I finally turned my head, just enough to meet his terrified eyes. "Let go of my arm, David," I said, my voice low and cold. And in that moment, as the auctioneer's voice hung in the air, I think he finally saw it. Not his father. Not his savior. He saw bidder number 27. I pulled my paddle from my jacket and raised it high and steady. 450,000, I said, my voice clear and firm, carrying easily in the crisp morning air. A hush fell over the crowd. The other bidders looked at me, reassessing. A jump of $10,000 was a signal. It said I wasn't here to bargain. It said I was here to win. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. I have 450,000. Do I hear 451? The man in the blue windbreaker hesitated, then shook his head and stepped back. He was out. The other man was already looking at the next property on his list. The fight was over before it began. 450,000 going once. The auctioneer bellowed, his gaze sweeping the steps, going twice. Jessica let out a sound, a strangled gasp of disbelief. No, she whispered, her eyes locked on me, wide with dawning horror. He wouldn't. David stood, paralyzed, his face ashen. The pieces were finally clicking into place in his mind, forming a picture he couldn't bear to look at. He wasn't watching a rescue. He was witnessing an acquisition. Sold! The crack of the gavel was like a gunshot in the quiet morning. For $450,000 to bidder number 27! The crowd began to disperse, their business here concluded. I lowered my arm and turned to Mr. Evans, who gave me a slight, professional nod. I felt David and Jessica approach, their footsteps heavy on the stone. How could you? David's voice was a ragged whisper. That was our home. That was Mom's home. I turned to face him fully. The anger, the grief, the 5 years of cold silence, it was all gone. All that was left was a quiet, unassailable truth. You were right, David, I said, my voice even. It's a house, an asset. I just made a sound investment. I looked past him to Jessica, whose face was a twisted mask of rage. You wanted to add $15,000 to its value by turning the garage into a gym. I think I'll leave the workbench right where it is. It has character. I turned my back on them then, on their shock and their ruin, and walked toward the clerk's table to sign the papers. I was buying back more than a house. I was buying back the years they had stolen, the dignity they had tried to strip away. As I signed my name on the line, I could feel the sun on my back, a little warmer now. I didn't look back to see them standing there, two ghosts on the steps of a life they had demolished with their own hands. I had a home to rebuild. If you liked this story, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what you thought. I really want to know your opinion. Here you will always find stories that move, surprise, and bring lessons to take with you for life. The house smells of sawdust and lemon oil now. It's a clean, honest scent that has finally pushed the last ghostly traces of Jessica's chemical-laden air fresheners out of the walls. The first thing I did after the papers were signed and the keys were back in my hand was hire a crew to paint over the sterile, lifeless gray. Every wall is now the same warm, buttery yellow Eleanor and I chose on a sunny afternoon in 1982. The color feels like a deep, satisfying breath after holding it for 5 long years. For a week, the house was empty, echoing with every footstep as I walked through the rooms, reacquainting myself with the space, feeling the spirit of the home slowly return. It wasn't their house anymore. It was a blank canvas, waiting for me to reclaim it. The work was slow and deliberate. I started in the backyard. With a heavy heart and a crowbar, I pried up every single piece of the cold slate patio they had installed. Underneath, the earth was compacted and dead, but I spent weeks turning it, enriching it with fresh soil. I found a small, family-owned nursery an hour away that still grew the Peace and Mr. Lincoln roses Eleanor had loved so dearly. Planting them felt like a sacred act, a promise I was finally keeping to her memory. Inside, I sanded the oak floors myself, the rhythmic hum of the machine, a steady companion in the quiet house. With each pass, I erased the scuffs from their furniture, the marks of their parties, until the wood's original warm grain shone through, ready for new memories. I didn't rush. I learned a long time ago that you don't force things. You measure twice, you cut once, you build slowly, and you build to last. The last thing to come back was my leather armchair. It had been in storage for 5 years, a lonely sentinel guarding a life I thought was lost forever. When the movers brought it in, wrapped carefully in a protective blanket, I had them place it not in its old spot facing the fireplace, but by the large bay window in the living room, the spot where the morning sun is brightest. From here, I don't see the ghosts of the past. I see the new rose bushes taking root in the garden. I see the neighborhood kids riding their bikes down the street. It's no longer the chair of a silent spectator, watching his life be dismantled. It's the chair of a man who owns his view. The worn leather, cracked and molded perfectly to my shape, doesn't feel like a relic anymore. It feels like a throne. A quiet, comfortable throne in a kingdom of one. Mr. Evans called last week to finalize some paperwork. He mentioned, in passing, that he'd heard David and Jessica had moved to another state, chasing some new business venture. I felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, just a distant, quiet finality. They were a chapter in a book I had already closed. They taught me the hardest lesson of my life. A home is not something you can just give away. It's something you build, you protect, and you inhabit with your own soul. They saw a house as an asset, a thing to be leveraged and sold. They never understood that its true value was in the love and labor soaked into its very foundation. Sitting here now, with the afternoon sun warming my face and the scent of roses drifting through the open window, I know this to be true. I am a builder. I built this house twice. The first time with wood and nails, for my family. The second time with patience and dignity, for myself. And this time, it is built to stand forever. As I sit here in my armchair, the evening light casting long shadows across the polished oak floors, I've had a lot of time to think. I've learned that the deepest betrayals don't come from enemies, but from those you loved enough to give your foundation to. For a long time, I thought I had lost everything, but what I lost was just a building. What I found was my own strength. This story was never about getting even. Revenge is a bitter meal that poisons the person who serves it. This was about remembering my own value. My son saw the house as a shortcut to wealth. But he never saw the true wealth in the skills my father passed down to me, the same skills I tried to pass down to him at that old workbench. He saw me as a relic, a piece of the past to be discarded. The ultimate lesson is this: your worth is not determined by the people who walk away from you. It is forged in your own hands, in your resilience, and in your ability to build, and if necessary, rebuild your own life. Dignity is the one home no one can ever take from you. It is the foundation you lay inside yourself, and it is built to last a lifetime. If you liked this story, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments what you thought. I really want to know your opinion. Here you will always find stories that move, surprise, and bring lessons to take with you for life.